Okay, in this video, I just want to mention a couple other things about pain and then talk a little about the placebo effect before we move on to the next topic after pain. So, remember Ronald Melzack, the guy who helped create the gait control model of pain? He also speculated that we were basically born with a neural network programmed by our genes that has a basic sense of the body that helps construct that sense of self and so on, what he called a neuromatrix. And after others kind of built off of his work and his theorizing, and especially his work on pain perception, now after decades of further research and developing technology like fMRI, where we can scan the brain while causing people pain, we've discovered quite a bit about what the brain is doing when we perceive pain. And it turns out the brain is doing a lot when we perceive pain. The signals from nociceptors, they go up through the thalamus and initially project largely to S1, the primary somatosensory cortex, up there in the parietal lobe. There are a lot of other areas that then receive signals about that pain or are involved in the processing of the pain, which makes sense because we already saw that pain involves a lot more than just registering that a nociceptor on a certain part of your body map has gone off. In the picture up here, you can see a summary of the network of different brain regions that all seem to be active during pain experiences, and different areas here seem to be relevant especially for certain aspects of pain perception. So the whole network has sometimes been called the pain matrix to emphasize that there's not one single pain area in the brain, but rather a wide network of areas that are all involved. Probably the biggest lesson to come out of the work on the pain matrix is that pain experiences generally involve two distinct and separable components of the pain experience. When we perceive pain, we're perceiving two different things at the same time. First, there's a sensory component of the pain, which shows up in verbal descriptions like throbbing pain, hot pain, dull, or shooting pain. It's usually measured or operationalized by asking someone to rate the intensity of the pain. That gets sort of at the sensory component. There's a certain level of how intense it is, and this aspect of pain perception is actually most closely linked to activity in S1, the area we might expect, right? The primary somatosensory cortex. It makes sense, especially when you realize the sensory component is also fundamentally connected to that experience of where the pain is happening. Where on the body are you feeling that shooting pain or that dull pain or whatever? But it also does involve other areas like the insula, you can see mentioned here. We'll return to that area of the brain later in the course. It's sort of tucked in, sometimes called the hidden fifth lobe of the cortex because it's a little under the surface, but we'll forget about that for now. We'll come back to it. The important thing is there's also a second component, a second really important separate component to pain perception, which we'll call the emotional component of pain. This shows up in descriptive terms people might use like it being an annoying or a sickening or a torturing pain. And it's captured best when we operationalize with measurements like asking someone to rate how unpleasant the pain is rather than how intense the pain is. Those are two separate things. So some pains can be really intense but not very unpleasant, and others can be very unpleasant even if the sensory component is not as intense. And that emotional component of pain is actually associated with, not surprisingly, some activity in the amygdala. That makes sense because we know that area, that part of the limbic system, is active during all sorts of emotional experiences and learning. But this emotional component of pain is especially strongly associated with activity in some areas that are a little more frontal than that. The anterior cingulate cortex is kind of toward the front, like approaching the frontal lobe. Don't worry about the neuroterminology, but it's an area that's also active for anticipating rewards, for learning what works and what hurts or what doesn't work, allocating attention and other things. But it's the brain area, that brain area up in the cortex that's most consistently linked to the experience of pain, especially the emotional aspect of pain, the unpleasantness of it. Some research even suggests it may be involved in monitoring what you might metaphorically call like social pain, like being excluded or being rejected by someone. So this area is also active when someone, the ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex, is also active when someone is like left out during a game, for example. And, the more active it is, it's more active depending on how rejected the person reports feeling. So if they report feeling more rejected, more left out, then we have even more activity there, kind of strongly correlated. Now, speaking of that social side of pain, some research has actually looked into empathy for when we see other people in pain. Probably the most well-known research paradigm brought couples into the laboratory where they had an MRI machine to do brain scans during various tasks. And in this case, they did an fMRI scan, so functional magnetic resonance imaging, a brain scan of women when they received painful shocks to themselves. That's the first condition. But in another condition, they scanned the same women's brains while they watched their beloved romantic partner receiving painful shocks. And you can see here from the averaged out scans showing areas with more activity than baseline. On this left side picture here, we have a lot of activity during the actual feeling of the shock. When she is herself getting shocked, we see a lot of activity distributed here, the pain matrix. Notice some activity up top in S1 and areas nearby, like we might expect, S2 and the association cortex of the parietal lobe up there. But we also have some activity closer to the middle of the brain, like around the limbic system, and it's kind of harder to see here, but the ACC, anterior cingulate cortex, a little further forward from there, that was also active. Makes sense. They were feeling pain, so the pain matrix is all active. But on this right side picture, this is the woman's brain while watching her beloved in pain. So there's no activity up there in the parietal lobe while watching someone else in pain. Nothing's going on in S1. Nothing about her own body map or homunculus is active. But she's still having activity in like those limbic areas and especially in the ACC, the areas related to the emotional component of pain. So there's no sensory component when watching someone else in pain. There's no sensory component, just the emotional component. And sure enough, this activity is what correlated with how unpleasant they rated it. Now, as a side note, I just want to mention you may have heard of some research back in the 2010s that seemed to suggest Tylenol, which is an analgesic pain blocker, can also block or dull the pain of social rejection, like social pain of being left out or rejected. It intuitively seems to make some sense, given what we've learned, but a lot of that research has been called into question and still sort of an active research area debating back and forth about whether the effect really exists. If the effect exists for Tylenol blocking feelings of social rejection, social pain, it's likely a pretty small effect, I think. But that does bring us to the topic of painkillers, of analgesic medications, some of which are obviously much stronger than Tylenol. For example, morphine. Morphine is a type of opioid, and opioids can be great at blocking pain. The reason for that is actually pretty simple. Morphine and other chemicals like it, opioids, they're incredibly similar to neurotransmitters that our brain already makes on its own. So you've no doubt heard of endorphins, like someone explaining that you get a rush of endorphins after intense exercise, or a rush of endorphins from having sex, or even from laughing really hard. So what are endorphins? The term is actually short for endogenous morphines. And endogenous just means made by the body. They are morphines that our body makes on its own. Specifically, endorphins they're neurotransmitters, so large ones, right? They're also part of the hormonal system. But they're these large neurotransmitters produced by the central nervous system to help block transmission of pain signals. And they also may produce like a feeling of euphoria. Now, endorphin release it's actually often triggered in response to pain. So it serves to decrease pain. Maybe the function of that, why we've evolved it, is so that we can continue to function even when we're injured, right? So you can get away from something or get to someplace safe. But endorphins are also released by vigorous exercise. Like if you've ever heard of a runner's high, for like a marathon runner, they hit this place, they get a runner's high, or after a really long run, really intense exercise, runner's high. That's endorphins. We know that Also, from lab studies, we know that we can decrease pain that someone is feeling by directly stimulating sites in the brain that produce endorphins. So endorphin-producing sites hook an electrode up there and turn it on to flood out some endorphins, and sure enough, people feel pain relief. And that's without needing to ingest any analgesic medication, right? Our brain makes its own morphines, makes its own analgesics. And that's good, that's healthy, that's an important function of the body, it's natural. Now, have you ever heard of naloxone? Narcan is one of the brand names you might have heard. It's a drug used to treat heroin overdose. Now, how does it do that? It actually blocks up the opioid receptors, the natural opioid receptors that we have, so that the heroin can't activate those neurons, the ones the receptors that heroin would normally hook onto and activate those neurons and cause heroin's effect. Can't do it if naloxone is there blocking them up. So heroin doesn't now have any receptors to fit into because that naloxone has mucked it all up, has gotten in the way. So the heroin doesn't do its thing. It can then leave the system. This has saved countless lives of people overdosing on heroin. So it's a really important drug. But here's where things get interesting. Naloxone also does something else. It increases pain. Like, getting cut will hurt worse to someone after they've gotten naloxone in their system. And why is that? Well, it kind of makes sense when you think about it, because when I say it's blocking the opioid receptors that heroin usually activates, those are the same damn receptors used by our natural, our built-in, our endogenous opioid system, our own endorphins. That's why heroin has an effect on us in the first place, is because we have an existing natural system in our body for those opioids like endorphins, right? That's the same reason that THC from cannabis gets you high, is because we have natural cannabinoid systems in our body. We produce endogenous, we produce our own cannabinoids for other purposes, but cannabis works on those in the same way that morphine and other opioids we might ingest from the outside, those work on the endogenous systems that are already there. So naloxone, if it's blocking these natural receptors, It'll block heroin, sure, but it'll also block our own endorphins. That makes sense. Endorphins block pain. Naloxone blocks endorphins, so we'll feel more pain. Injuries will hurt more. That makes sense. Now, why then is this so damn interesting for pain perception researchers? Well, because naloxone also decreases the pain relief of placebos. Like, normally, handing someone a placebo, a sugar pill, an empty, inert placebo pill that does nothing, and telling them it's an analgesic medication, normally that'll make them feel less pain from any injury that they have, right? Placebos work. Likewise, injecting saline, like basically just salt water, totally empty, inert saline that doesn't do anything, inject that into them, but tell them you're injecting an analgesic drug, and that works even better as a placebo. Like, some placebos are better than others. The placebo effect is stronger in cases where people have even stronger expectations. So the old kind of mind over matter kind of thing, right? Except if the placebo effect was just mind over matter, then naloxone shouldn't stop the placebo effect from working, but it does. Which tells us something. It suggests the placebo effect for pain works largely by releasing endorphins. That's what the placebo effect is for pain. When you induce expectations of pain relief, the way it works is by triggering your brain to unleash the endorphins, to turn on its own inner morphine system. So we might ask, does the placebo effect just flood our whole freaking body with endorphins? Or is it more selective than that? Like, if we put a pain cream on the foot that's hurting, does our whole body get high on endorphins? Or mainly just the foot region where we expect the pain relief from that pain cream? And studies have actually answered that. So for example, this one study here, they brought people into a lab, they created some pain in specific parts of the body. How'd they do that? Well, I've mentioned before, we sometimes study pain in the lab with like how long they hold their hand in super cold water. Or we study pain by applying a heat stimulus. Well, in this case, they did it by injecting capsaicin. That's the stuff that gives peppers their hotness. So I mentioned before that our nociceptors fire not just to physical damage, not just to thermal damage, but also to chemical damage too. So this is just another way to turn on our pain receptors. To turn on nociceptors is with some capsaicin in the skin. It hurts. So in this study, they injected capsaicin just under the skin in 4 parts of the body. They did it in the left hand, the right hand, the left foot, and the right foot. So 4 places where people just feel some pain on their body. And then they asked people how much pain they felt. So for the basic condition, you can think of this, the baseline condition here, you can see the average pain ratings that people felt in those 4 locations. And it turns out there's no statistically significant difference here. There's no difference in pain for those 4 locations, okay? So the numbers look a little different, but that, averaging them across a lot of people, no statistically significant difference there. It's the same pain across all those locations. Now, that was the control condition, but some other groups got a placebo. In this case, they had some cream rubbed on particular locations and were told this is an analgesic, a really powerful analgesic, a powerful pain relief cream. It'll block the pain. That's what they were told. That's what they expected. But it was actually a placebo. There's no medication in the cream at all. It had no real effect as a medication. It didn't affect nociceptor firing at all. Yet those who got the placebo cream reported significantly less pain. That's the placebo effect in action. But here's the cool part. They only experienced the placebo effect for the body part that had the placebo cream on it. So if the cream was on their left hand, they felt significantly less pain there. We've shown this in bold because it's statistically significantly different from all these other numbers. Statistically significant effect. And you can see a pretty large effect, right? The difference between around 6 and 3, that's like half the pain. So a pretty big difference in the pain, but only in the location where we put that placebo cream on it. If the placebo cream was on their right hand and their left foot, then those 2 areas and only those 2 areas experienced less pain. The placebo effect was specific to it. So something like top down, like attending to certain areas, other research has shown, or like this, expecting less pain there from the placebo effect, that can actually initiate a process in the brain to activate pathways, to release endorphins at specific locations in the body. So the placebo effect isn't magic, and it isn't the mind overcoming the body. Rather, it's one part of the body, it's the brain, signaling some chemical release in another part of the body. So we might say central nervous system over peripheral nervous system rather than mind over matter. It's top-down processes overruling bottom-up processing, which is still really cool. Okay, so we'll end there for our pain topic. That leaves us one last big topic to talk about for our big combined somatosensory system, our bodily senses, which is the earlier we skipped the proprioception system, kind of our sense of our limbs and muscles and things like that. And we skipped the vestibular system, our sense of balance or equilibrioception. And I said we'd come back to those, so that'll be our next topic. We'll finish up somatosensation there. It's also where we'll talk about some cool effects like sensory adaptation before we move on to some very distinct other systems.